Alright, so I definitely think that this is supposed to be the July update. Apologies for getting it up so late. It's been a little hectic here, and internet's been kind of bad, especially with all the flooding and the rains and stuff that we've been getting, because right now we're in the rainy season, which is also just the busiest time in Ghana because it's the farming season, because so many farmers rely on the rain to irrigate their crops. So it's just been a little crazy, and when it rains here, it really rains. But I'll get onto that in a little bit. So, uh, updates. So, as you all know from my last video, I'm extending my service with a USAID program called Ring. And the first month on the job has really been an eye-opening experience. The first portion of my service, I guess I can actually say the first 21 months of my service, was working in a small rural community with about 1,500 people. And experience as a Peace Corps volunteer there, working on grassroots initiatives to help farmers improve farming practices, as well as focusing on a lot of household nutrition, and sort of kind of being my community's number one advocate in terms of getting both outside support from NGOs as well as government agencies, was a very different perspective and experience of working in development work than what I've been experiencing for the last month. The last month working with Ring has been interesting, primarily because my role is now shifted in terms of how I don't work just in one community. I actually work with 14 different districts in northern region of Ghana. And within those districts, there are numerous communities that we work with, and these districts are targeted as districts that need support, and they're either Ring offers support by either providing training and oversight to the government officials to go in and do work, or we ourselves go in and actually do the work and work directly with the communities. It all depends on the amount of resources that are available and also the need of the communities and the districts that we're working in. What I will say, though, is that Ring specifically targets the most impoverished, most underdeveloped, most rural communities within these 14 districts in northern region, which offers a very interesting perspective. For those of you that don't know, when Peace Corps is actually placing volunteers within communities, there are certain requirements that the communities have to meet, one of which has to be cell phone service. So that means that even though we might not have the best cell service, which was the situation in my community where I wasn't able to always make phone calls, I couldn't always send WhatsApps, things like that. Even though it wasn't there all the time, I was able to access it. There are communities in Ghana where there's absolutely no cell phone reception, and Peace Corps doesn't send volunteers into those communities because of safety and security issues. So it's now interesting that I'm seeing communities that are even more isolated than the community that I was living in, or communities that I see other volunteers live in. And that's something that I wanted to talk about. So a lot of my work in terms of what I'm doing is I'm acting as the conservation agriculture advisor, more or less. And I'm overseeing the farming practices and techniques that Ring goes in and offers to teach government officials and communities. And some of the projects that we work on are orange flesh sweet potatoes, or OFSP as we call them, which is, well, they're sweet potatoes, and they grow really well in the northern regions, and they're a primary source of nutrition for a lot of these rural communities, and that's one of the main things that we work on. So the other things that I'm working on is leafy green cultivation for year-round. So this is focusing on like home gardens or small plots of land where groups of women will take care of a half an acre or an acre to cultivate leafy green vegetables throughout the year. With this project, we're also training women on how to set up drip irrigation lines and care for those drip irrigation lines throughout the year. So that's been interesting. I'm also working on a beekeeping project, and with this beekeeping project, it's working with farmers on how to keep and manage bees, how bees will improve crop yields, also harvesting honey, and then also making byproducts from beeswax and things like that. And then also I'm working on a poultry project, and poultry project is pretty fascinating because the pilot that we have right now is actually a project with 14 different women that care for 295 birds. And the primary purpose of rearing these birds is to have eggs for household consumption, and then also to sell any extra eggs that are collected from these birds. And this is actually really important because in the northern region, not very many people rear fowl because the heat is extremely high up here. A lot of airborne illnesses kill poultry, and there's a huge problem with malnutrition because kids aren't getting the proper amount of protein that they need. So the eggs are really a means for the kids to be able to get a more balanced diet and also to get the protein that they need, because protein, when talking about coming from meat, is extremely expensive. And because a lot of people don't farm year-round because it's impossible to do it because of lack of water, you also can't supplement protein intake with dark leafy greens. So fowl is a way that we can try to have protein on a daily basis introduced to the diets of these families in these rural communities. All right, so that's what I've been working on. So the first week on the job, I actually visited this area called Karga District, and Karga is one of the poorest districts in really all of Ghana, but absolutely one of the poorest district, or is the poorest district within northern region. And what to say about that? Karga required us to travel about 6 hours into the bush, and into the bush means off paved roads, dirt beaten paths, just trekking a very long way. And when we got into one of the communities that we were working in, it was very eye-opening. This community, it probably had about 10 households in it, an entire community of 10 households, but there are probably about 2 or 3 families living in each household, so we call those compounds. And the kids end up walking about an hour to a junction where then they beg for a ride, or pray that somebody is coming along to take them another hour to the nearest school, or they end up walking the whole way. And there are no clinics, there are no schools close by, and that was the community that we were working in that day. So there's also another community that they actually call Overseas. And Overseas, it gets that name because there's a part of the road that during rainy season, it just fills with water and it washes out the entire road. And the only way to get across it is if you park your vehicle on one side and you get into a canoe. And then the canoe takes you across this water body of water, and then you hop on a motorcycle and they take you the rest of the way into this community, and that's the only way that you can get in. And when you think about communities being isolated like this, it really makes you think about the types of resources that are available to come in and out of these communities, the types of support that's being offered. And when you have a government structure such as Ghana, where there's not a lot of funding that's actually provided to help farmers with agriculture development, which is the number one occupation in Ghana, essentially, is farming. Everybody farms. Or you don't have funding to be able to build a new school, or you don't have funding to build a clinic, you essentially have these communities of pure isolation where they're just not getting the resources that every other community is getting. And sometimes they're so isolated, government officials don't even know that they actually exist out there, and somebody just happens to stumble upon you. So these are the types of communities that I'm working in. And it feels like there's a lot of opportunity to provide assistance. And working with Ring has given me the ability to really access these communities that have been shut off from aid or support from government officials or entities. And I like that. I like that I'm able to offer some assistance to these communities, because they're people that really need assistance, and they're also people that want the assistance. And they're very gracious, very receptive to the trainings, to the tools, and to working with us. And that's great, because sometimes you work in communities and not everybody wants your assistance. So the question becomes, why am I even here if you don't want the assistance? And it's really nice to work together with these communities. So I've really been enjoying that, and I really like the opportunity that Ring is giving me to work with these types of communities. With that said, something else that my job requires is not just going into the communities and assessing and training on local levels, but also part of my job is training government officials and extension officers for MOFA, which is the Ministry of Farming and Agriculture. And so this is an opportunity to really build on long-term sustainable farming practices, working with educated government officials, veterinary officers, agronomists, and teaching about sustainable farming practices, or talking about different methods to cultivate crops through the dry season when there's not a lot of water. And by providing those trainings to these government officials, then they're able to go into the communities and offer those types of trainings and really work with communities on becoming self-sustained, which is the ultimate goal, is helping create communities become 100% self-sustained, because projects like Ring are only around for 5 years, and we need to be making sure that everything that we do actually helps people remain in livelihoods that are sustained past the existence of Ring. So that's been really great to actually work with these government officials that are also very enthusiastic about learning new methods and going out there and really trying to help these communities that just need the assistance. And so I've really been enjoying talking to the government officials and the extension officers and all of these different people that I'm working with on coming up with better poultry rearing practices, coming up with conservation ag techniques, and all of these things, and really trying to identify what's important for the communities that we're working in. With that being said, I do want to talk about the flooding. So something that is really heartbreaking is that here in Northern Region, we're working with communities that experience some of the longest durations of hunger months. And I think in earlier videos, I've actually talked about hunger months and how hunger months are actually durations of time where farmers are not cultivating any new crops and they're living completely off of crops that they harvested previously that year. And this becomes a problem because a lot of the times there's post-harvest loss, meaning that the crops that you cultivated and then harvested and stored, they didn't get stored properly, so there might be bugs in it. There might have been bugs in it. They might have just there might have been rot, there might have been too much moisture. There's all of these different things that end up happening to these crops. So the stockpile that these farmers were trying to hold on to get themselves through the dry seasons, they also are diminishing. And so what ends up happening is these farmers experience these durations of time where there's just no fresh food that's being brought in, and they're actually experiencing hunger. And let's see, last year I think I was talking about how in Upper West, another region that I've done some work in, there was a seven-month duration of no fresh food coming in, and it was 7 months of hunger. Northern region last year experienced 5 months. So it's a hardship. So when the rains come, it's extremely important that the crops grow and that they're able to harvest the food and that they're able to properly store the food so they can get through another 5, 6, 7 months where there's no crops coming in. But the hardship about that is that in the dry season, people are starving, but also in the rainy season, people are starving. And the reason is because the way that the rain falls here in Northern Region is extremely aggressive. So what ends up happening is you go the majority of the year where you have no rain, and then when the rain finally comes in and you're trying to cultivate these crops, there's massive flooding of the crops, so there's crop destruction. The roads to your farms get flooded, so you can't even check on your farm, you can't even harvest your crops. Or sometimes when you do harvest it and you try to get it into the storage facility ends up flooding and it destroys the food that you had grown. So it's kind of like this situation of where, like, you have no rain and you're hungry, and then you get rain, but it's too much rain and you're still hungry. So it's frustrating, you know. It's messed up. It really sucks. So one of the projects that Ring is working on is orange flesh sweet potato vine distribution. And one of the things that we're doing with this is that we've identified several locations where there are multiplication sites where we cultivate the vines for the sweet potatoes, and then we distribute the vines to these communities, and the farmers transplant the vines, and then they then they grow these sweet potato crops. And the idea behind this is that we teach you how to cultivate the vines, so that way you also harvest the vines, and then you put some of the vines aside, and then you multiply them. And this idea is that you're supposed to end up having your own nursery within your community that allows for you to cultivate vines and take from them. Well, 3 of the vine locations that Ring had were destroyed from the rain. So now communities that were being offered 15,000 vines are getting like 3,000 vines. So it's messed up. So something that I'm now looking into is we're trying to redesign some of the multiplication sites and looking at contouring land in order to control for flooding, or looking at different locations where we can set up these vine multiplication sites, because that's devastating to lose so many vines like that, and to have people in communities that are relying on you to be able to get these vines and not be able to do it because of the rain. So growing pains, opportunities to look at new ways to develop lands, also an opportunity to start conversations about conservation agriculture and where you place multiplication sites, where you place crops, and really how to work with the land in order to get the best outcome for your crops. And this is something that's not talked a lot about in Ghana, but to be completely honest, this is also something that is extremely new to even American farmers, because climate change, weather patterns change, so people have to start adopting new methods to cultivate crops. So it's been interesting. It's been interesting to see what it is like to really work in extremely rural, extremely isolated communities. It's been interesting to see what it's like to work alongside government officials when there's no type of funding to do these types of projects. And it's been interesting to really kind of experience this concept of what happens when the rains come and they flood your crops, and what does that mean for families when the rain stops and you're now in the dry season and you now don't even have as many crops as you thought you were going to have or saved because some of it was destroyed. So I'm very thankful for this experience, and I'm really enjoying working with these communities, and the staff on Ring has been amazing. There's some really excellent people that I'm able to work with, and yeah, so it's been a hectic month, but it's cool because we're moving in a direction that's positive. But yeah. So anyway, long video update on what I've been up to. I hope everybody's well. Wishing my sister a belated birthday. And yeah, so hopefully I'll get an update for you soon. All right, later.